Margaret Ellis had lived in the same little house on the edge of Cedar Hollow for 32 years. She knew every creak in the floorboards, every bird that nested in the eaves, and every season's rhythm like the lines on her own hands. At 68, she'd traded chalkboards and lesson plans for trowels and tomato vines. Retirement hadn't been what she expected. Less quiet, more full of small wonders. She liked it that way. Her backyard wasn't fancy. No stone patio or koi pond, just a patch of grass, a few flower beds she kept tidy, and an old oak tree that had been there long before she arrived. Its branches stretched wide, casting dappled shade over the yard even on the hottest July afternoons. That's where she was on a Tuesday in early May, kneeling in the soft earth, gloves dusted with soil, snipping dead blooms off her climbing roses. The air smelled like damp earth and lilacs, and the only sound was the distant hum of a lawnmower and the occasional chirp from a robin. She'd just tied back a stubborn vine when she noticed it. A mound near the base of the oak, about the size of a basketball but lumpy and uneven, like someone had dumped a pile of fine sand and forgotten about it. Ants swarmed over it in steady streams, tiny dark bodies moving with purpose. Nothing unusual, she thought at first. Ants were part of garden life. They aerated the soil, cleaned up crumbs, and mostly kept to themselves. But something about this mound felt off. For one, it was too big. The ant hills she'd seen before were small, maybe the size of a coffee mug, and usually crumbled after a good rain. This one looked solid, almost sculpted. And the ants, they weren't just crawling randomly. They moved in tight, synchronized lines like soldiers on a mission. Some carried bits of leaf, others tiny white specks she couldn't identify. They didn't scatter when her shadow fell over them. They just kept going, as if they had no time for distractions. She leaned closer, squinting. The soil around the mound felt warm. Not hot, just noticeably warmer than the cool earth a few inches away. She pressed the back of her hand to it. Yep, warm. That didn't make sense. It wasn't a compost pile. There was no rotting wood or manure nearby. Just grass, roots, and dirt. A little shiver ran down her spine, not from fear, but from that old teacher's instinct. This is worth paying attention to. She stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her knees, and walked back to the house. Inside, she poured herself a glass of iced tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the oak tree. The mound sat there quiet and unassuming, but now it seemed to hum with secrets. She wondered if it might be damaging the tree's roots, or maybe tunneling under her garden shed. She'd heard stories of fire ants or carpenter ants causing real trouble, though she'd never seen either around here. Cedar Hollow was the kind of town where people still called the county extension office for advice about squash bugs or mildew on zinnias. So after lunch, she picked up the phone and dialed the number she'd had taped to her fridge for years. "Hi, yes," she said when a friendly voice answered. "My name's Margaret Ellis. I've got a bit of a situation in my backyard. There's this ant nest. Well, it's more like a hill, really, and it's bigger than any I've ever seen. And the ground around it feels warm. Is that normal?" The woman on the other end listened patiently, asked a few questions. What color the ants were, how fast they moved, whether she'd seen wings or mounds like this before. Margaret answered as best she could. She wasn't an expert, just a curious woman with a garden and a good memory. "Well," the woman said finally, "most ant hills aren't warm. That part's unusual. I'll make a note and see if someone from the university can take a look. We've been getting more calls about strange insect behavior lately. Maybe it's the weather." Margaret thanked her and hung up, not expecting much. Probably, she figured, some student would swing by in a week, poke at the dirt with a stick, and tell her it was nothing to worry about. She went back outside to finish her gardening, but her eyes kept drifting back to the mound. Over the next 2 days, she watched it like a cat watches a bird. She noticed the ants worked all day and night. She'd seen their tiny silhouettes moving under the moonlight. She also noticed the mound seemed to be growing. Not fast, but steadily. New tunnels appeared at the edges, and the surface looked smoother, almost polished in places, like it had been packed down by tiny, careful feet. On the third morning, just after sunrise, she saw something that made her pause. A thin wisp of vapor, barely visible, rose from the center of the mound. It vanished in seconds, but she was sure she'd seen it. Like breath on a cold morning, but it was nearly 70 degrees out, that was it. She called the extension office again. "I know I just called," she said, "but I really think you should send someone soon. There's something different about this." This time her call was passed along. Later that afternoon, a woman named Dr. Elena Ruiz called her back. Her voice was calm but sharp, like someone used to listening for details others missed. "Ms. Ellis," she said, "you mentioned the soil is warm and there's vapor. Can you describe the ants again?" Margaret did. Small, dark brown, fast-moving, no wings, no aggression toward her. She even described the way they carried those tiny white specks. There was a pause on the line. Then Dr. Ruiz said, "I'd like to come see this myself. Would tomorrow morning work?" Margaret nearly dropped the phone. "Of course. You're welcome any time." She spent the rest of the day cleaning up the yard, not because she cared about appearances, but because she wanted the place to look respectable for a scientist. She swept the porch, coiled the garden hose, and even put out a fresh pitcher of lemon water with mint from her herb patch. That night she barely slept. Her mind buzzed with questions. Was it dangerous? Was it rare? Was it important? The next morning, a dusty blue pickup truck rolled down her gravel driveway. Out stepped a woman in khaki pants, a faded university t-shirt, and boots caked with dried mud. She had kind eyes and a quick smile, and she carried a small metal case that clinked softly as she walked. "Ms. Ellis," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Elena. Thank you for calling." Margaret shook her hand, relieved to see someone who looked like she belonged in the field, not a lab coat and clipboard. "Please, call me Margaret," she said, "and thank you for coming all this way." She led Elena to the oak tree. As they approached, both women slowed. The mound was even more striking in daylight. Its surface rippled with tiny ridges like the texture of a seashell. Ants moved in perfect rhythm, flowing in and out of dozens of tiny openings. Elena crouched down, not touching anything, just observing. She pulled a small device from her pocket, a thermal reader, and pointed it at the mound. The screen blinked, then showed a reading, 78 degrees Celsius. The surrounding soil read 64 degrees Celsius. "Huh," she murmured. "That's significant." She took out a magnifying lens and studied the ants. Then she gently scraped a bit of soil from the edge with a plastic spoon and sealed it in a vial. "These aren't fire ants," she said, "and they're not carpenter ants either. Their behavior, it's unusually organized." Margaret crossed her arms, watching. "I've lived here over 30 years. I've never seen anything like this." Elena nodded slowly. "Me neither." She stood up and looked around the yard, the oak, the garden, the quiet street beyond. "This might be more than just a nest," she said quietly. "It might be something we don't fully understand yet." Margaret felt a strange mix of pride and unease. Pride that her little backyard held a mystery. Unease because mysteries once uncovered could change everything. "Do you think it's safe?" she asked. "For now, yes," Elena said. "They're not aggressive. But I'd like to bring a small team tomorrow, just 2 others. We'll be careful. We won't dig unless we have to. Mostly, we'll scan and observe," Margaret agreed. She trusted the woman's calm certainty. Besides, curiosity had always been her strongest trait, even stronger than caution. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Margaret sat on her porch swing with a cup of chamomile tea. Crickets began their nightly song. The mound sat in shadow, but she could still see the faint glint of ant trails moving like silver threads in the dusk. She thought about her students, the ones who'd asked why. 100 times a day, she'd always told them that the best discoveries start with noticing something small that doesn't quite fit. A misplaced comma, a strange cloud, an anthill that's too warm. Now here she was, retired and alone, standing at the edge of something she couldn't explain. And for the first time in years, she felt that old spark, the one that made her love teaching, the one that said, "There's more to this world than we think." She didn't know it yet. But her quiet backyard was about to become the center of a story that would ripple far beyond Cedar Hollow. Scientists would come, cameras would roll, headlines would buzz, but right now, in the soft evening light, it was just her, the oak tree and a mound of earth humming with secrets, and Margaret Ellis, who had spent her life helping others see the wonder in small things, was about to witness a wonder of her own. She smiled, sipped her tea, and whispered to the night, "Well, look at you." The next morning came with a sky so clear it looked painted, blue all the way to the edges, not a cloud in sight. Margaret woke before her alarm, something she hadn't done in years. She made coffee, fed the birds on the windowsill, and kept glancing out toward the oak tree. The mound sat there, quiet as ever, but now it felt like it was waiting. By 9, the blue pickup was back, this time with 2 other people in it. A younger man with a camera-like device strapped to his shoulder, and a woman carrying what looked like a metal suitcase with blinking lights. They introduced themselves simply. One studied soil and microbes. The other was a grad student helping with fieldwork. Margaret didn't catch their full names, and they didn't seem to mind. They were all business but polite, and they treated her yard like a library, quiet, respectful, careful not to step where they weren't needed. Elena, the scientist from the day before, greeted Margaret with a warm nod and a thermos of tea she'd brought as a thank you. "Hope you don't mind us turning your backyard into a lab for a few days," she said with a small smile. "Mind?" Margaret laughed. "I'm honored. Just don't let my roses get jealous." They set up a small folding table near the porch and laid out their gear: sensors, vials, notebooks, and a laptop that whirred softly as it booted up. The younger man began walking slow circles around the mound with his device, which made quiet beeping sounds every few seconds. The other woman knelt at the edge of the grass with a thin metal rod she pressed into the ground. Every few inches she'd pause, jot something down, then move on. Margaret watched from her porch swing, sipping her second cup of coffee. She offered them lemon water, which they accepted gratefully. No one rushed. No one shouted orders. It felt less like an investigation and more like a group of people trying to listen to something very quiet. After about an hour, Elena came over and sat beside her. "We're doing something called ground-penetrating radar," she explained, keeping her voice low. "It sends harmless waves into the soil and shows us what's underneath, like an X-ray for the Earth." Margaret nodded. "So you can see how deep the nest goes." "Exactly. And if there's anything unusual down there, rocks, pipes, voids. Or structures." "Structures?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Well," Elena hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Ants usually dig simple tunnels. Straight down, maybe a few side chambers for eggs or food. But what you described, the warmth, the vapor, the way the ants move, it suggests something more complex. Maybe even layered." Margaret looked back at the mound. It still looked like a pile of dirt to her. But she'd learned long ago that things aren't always what they seem. The radar scan took most of the morning. The team moved in slow, overlapping grids, marking points with small orange flags. By noon, they'd covered a 10-foot radius around the oak. The grad student uploaded the data to the laptop, and all 3 of them huddled around the screen. Margaret stayed back, not wanting to intrude, but she saw their shoulders tense. Elena let out a soft wow. Curiosity got the better of her. "Bad news?" she asked gently. Elena turned, eyes wide but not alarmed. "No, not bad, just unexpected." She motioned for Margaret to come closer. On the screen was a cross-section image of the soil beneath her yard, shades of gray and black showing roots, rocks, and layers of earth. But right under the mound there was a shape that didn't belong. It looked like a bulb or a cluster of grapes, but made of dense, interconnected tunnels. And it went down, way down, 6 feet? Margaret guessed. 8, Elena said. Maybe more. And it's not just tunnels. There are chambers, some round, some oval. And look here. She pointed to a faint, web-like pattern surrounding the main structure. That's not soil. It's something else, something denser. The soil specialist leaned in. It's almost like a shell, or a cocoon, but woven into the earth. They decided to take a small core sample, just a narrow tube of soil pulled gently from the edge of the mound, far from the main entrance. Using a hand auger, they drilled down 6 inches and extracted a cylinder of earth about the width of a soda can. It came out surprisingly firm, not crumbly like regular dirt. Back at the table, they split it open carefully. Inside, the soil was dark and moist, but threaded through it were thin, glossy strands, like spider silk, but stiffer. And embedded in the matrix were tiny flecks that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. "What are those?" Margaret asked, leaning in. "We don't know yet," Elena admitted, "but they're not mineral. They look organic, maybe fungal, maybe something else." The grad student placed a fragment under a portable microscope and connected it to the laptop. On screen, the strands resolved into intricate, branching networks, like miniature tree roots but glowing slightly under UV light. "That's not normal," the soil specialist murmured. "Fungal hyphae don't usually organize like that, and they don't glow." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the breeze. This wasn't just ants digging holes. This was something built, designed almost. They worked through lunch eating sandwiches on the grass without taking their eyes off the data. Margaret brought out extra plates and cookies, feeling like a host at a very strange dinner party. She didn't understand half of what they were saying, terms like mycelial integration and thermal convection, but she understood their tone. They were excited and a little awed. By mid-afternoon, they'd set up a time-lapse camera pointed at the mound and placed small motion sensors around its perimeter. "We want to see if activity changes at night," Elena explained. "Sometimes these systems are more active in the dark." As the sun began to dip, the team packed up most of their gear but left the sensors and camera running. Elena turned to Margaret before leaving. "We're going to run more tests tomorrow," she said, "but I need to be honest with you. This is unlike anything we've documented in this region. It might be a new behavior, or even a new interaction between species." Margaret crossed her arms, looking at the oak tree, at the quiet mound, at the flag still stuck in her grass. "Is it dangerous?" Elena shook her head. "No signs of aggression. The ants ignore us completely, and nothing here suggests toxins or disease. If anything, the soil around the mound is richer, more nutrients, better structure. Your garden might actually be healthier because of it." That surprised Margaret. "So it's helping?" "Maybe," Elena said with a thoughtful smile. "Nature's full of partnerships we don't understand yet." They left shortly after, promising to return early the next day. Margaret stood in the driveway, watching the truck disappear down the road. The yard felt different now, not just hers anymore, but part of something larger. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about those glowing threads, the deep chambers, the warmth rising from the earth. She went outside in her robe and slippers, flashlight in hand. The time-lapse camera blinked red in the dark. The mound was still, but when she crouched down and held her hand near it, she felt it again, that gentle warmth like the earth was breathing. The next morning, the team arrived even earlier. This time, they brought a larger radar unit and a small tent to shield their equipment from sun and wind. Word had started to spread. A neighbor walking his dog paused at the fence. "Everything okay, Margaret?" "Saw all the gear. Just some scientists studying ants," she said lightly. "Ants? In this heat?" He chuckled and walked on, but not before giving the mound a curious look. By midday, the new radar scans confirmed it. The structure went down at least 10 feet, maybe 12. And it wasn't just vertical. It branched outward in wide, sweeping arcs like the roots of a giant underground flower. Even more puzzling, the thermal readings showed consistent warmth throughout the entire network, not just at the surface. "They're regulating temperature," the soil specialist said, amazed. "Like a living HVAC system." "How?" Margaret asked. "No idea. But it's precise. Within half a degree all the way down." They decided to try a non-invasive probe, a thin fiber optic camera on a flexible wire, usually used to inspect pipes. They fed it slowly into one of the outer tunnels, watching the live feed on a tablet. The screen showed smooth, curved walls, not rough like dug earth, but polished, almost glazed. And lining the walls were those same shimmering strands, now clearly woven into the surface like veins. Every few inches there were small nodules, round pearl-like structures that pulsed faintly with light. The grad student gasped. "Are those bioluminescent?" "Looks like it," Elena whispered. Margaret watched, heart pounding. It was beautiful, like watching stars form in miniature. Then something moved. A cluster of ants appeared on screen carrying more of those white specks. But this time they weren't just dropping them. They were placing them carefully into the nodules. As they did, the nodules brightened slightly. "It's a delivery system," Elena said, voice hushed. "They're feeding something. But what?" the soil specialist asked. No one answered. They all knew the same thought was running through their heads. This isn't just a nest. It's a farm, or a factory, or something we don't have a word for yet. By late afternoon, the team was buzzing, not with panic, but with the kind of energy that comes when you're standing on the edge of a discovery. They called their department head, spoke in low, urgent tones, and were told to proceed with extreme care, but keep going. Margaret made them iced tea and listened as they debated theories. Maybe the ants were farming a special fungus. Maybe the fungus was producing light for reasons unknown. Maybe the whole system was a response to climate change or soil chemistry or something deeper in the earth. One thing was clear. This wasn't random. It was coordinated. Intelligent, even. As the sun set, they packed up again, but this time Elena stayed behind for a moment. "Margaret," she said, "we might need to bring in more experts. Maybe even get permission to do a very small excavation, just enough to take a sample of that wall material. But only if you're comfortable." Margaret looked at her backyard, the roses, the oak, the quiet mound that had turned her world upside down. She thought about her students, how she'd always told them that knowledge comes with responsibility. "I trust you," she said simply. "Just promise me you'll treat it like it matters." "Because it does." Elena nodded. "It matters more than you know." That night, Margaret sat on her porch longer than usual. The camera blinked. The ants worked in the dark, and deep below her feet something ancient and clever hummed with quiet life. She didn't know it yet, but tomorrow, everything would change. The world beyond Cedar Hollow was about to take notice. And her little backyard, once just a place to grow flowers and watch birds, was about to become a window into a secret world no one knew existed. The third morning dawned with a hush, as if the whole neighborhood knew something big was about to happen. Margaret woke to the sound of distant thunder, though the sky was clear, and the soft rustle of leaves in a breeze that carried the scent of rain that never came. She made her coffee stronger than usual, her hands steady but her mind racing. Today was the day they'd go deeper. By 8, the blue pickup was back, but this time it wasn't alone. A second vehicle, a white van with a university logo, pulled into her driveway. More people stepped out, not in lab coats, but in field gear. Boots, cargo pants, vests with too many pockets. They moved with quiet purpose, unloading crates of equipment that looked like something out of a nature documentary. High-resolution scanners, sealed sample containers, and a small generator that hummed softly once it was set up near the garden shed. Elena greeted Margaret with a tired but excited smile. "We got approval," she said quietly, "for a minimal excavation, just enough to get a clean sample of the inner wall. We'll go no deeper than 2 feet and only from a side tunnel, far from the main chambers." Margaret nodded. "As long as you're careful, we will be. This isn't just science to us anymore. It feels sacred." That word, sacred, stuck with Margaret all morning. She watched as the team marked a spot 3 feet from the main mound, where radar showed a narrow, unused tunnel. Using hand tools, small trowels, brushes, even dental picks, they began to dig. No machines, no shovels, just slow, patient work, like archaeologists uncovering a buried temple. Neighbors started to notice. First, it was just curious glances over fences. Then a few stopped their cars. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered at the end of her driveway, mostly locals, some with kids, all wondering why scientists were treating a patch of dirt like it held gold. Margaret didn't mind. She set out a folding chair and a cooler of water bottles, offering them to anyone who lingered. "It's just ants," she'd say with a shrug, though they all knew it was more than that now. Inside the tent they'd erected over the dig site, the air was thick with concentration. The grad student held a video feed from a micro camera as the lead excavator, a quiet woman with sun-weathered hands, gently scraped away layers of soil. Each movement was recorded, photographed, logged. Nothing was touched without being documented first. Then, around 11, someone whispered, "Got it." They'd reached the inner wall. On the monitor, the surface glowed faintly, a soft, pearlescent sheen like moonlight on wet stone. The material wasn't soil. It wasn't wood or resin either. It felt smooth to the touch, slightly flexible and cool despite the warm earth around it. Embedded in it were those same luminous nodules, now clearly connected by a web of fine thread-like channels. Using sterilized tweezers, they took a sample the size of a thumbnail and sealed it in an airtight vial. The moment it was removed, the surrounding ants, previously ignoring the humans, paused. For just a few seconds, their movement slowed. Then, as if receiving a signal, they redirected their paths, sealing off the exposed tunnel with pellets of soil and plant matter in under a minute. "They knew," the soil specialist murmured. "They sensed the breach." Back at the folding table, under a portable UV lamp, the sample came alive. The nodules pulsed with a gentle blue-green light, and the threads between them flickered like live wires. Elena placed a conductivity tester on the edge of the sample. The meter jumped. "It's conducting electricity," she said, stunned. "Very low voltage, but consistent." "How?" Margaret asked, peering over her shoulder. "We don't know, but look at this." She pointed to a magnified image on the laptop. These threads, they're not just carrying nutrients. They're structured like neural pathways, or circuitry. A silence fell over the group. Even the grad student stopped typing. You're saying, it's thinking? Margaret asked slowly. No, Elena corrected gently. Not thinking like we do, but it might be processing information, responding, adapting. They ran more tests. Spectroscopy revealed organic compounds never before recorded in ant-related structures. Complex sugars, proteins, and something that resembled chitin, but altered in a way that made it both strong and conductive. The fungus, if it was fungus, wasn't just growing. It was integrating. By early afternoon, the team made a decision. They needed to bring in a specialist in bioelectrical systems, someone who studied how living things use tiny electrical signals to communicate, like how plants warn each other of pests or how fungi share resources through underground networks. While they made calls, Margaret walked among the onlookers, answering questions as best she could. No, it's not radioactive, she told one worried man. No, the ants won't swarm the town, she assured a nervous mother. And no, I don't think it's aliens, she added with a chuckle, though part of her wondered if it might as well be. Back at the dig site, the team carefully backfilled the small hole they'd made, packing the soil gently, almost reverently. Then, using a fine mist sprayer, they dampened the area to help the ants rebuild. Within an hour, new tunnels were already forming. But the real surprise came that evening. After the team left, taking the sample with them in a climate-controlled case, they set up a new sensor array. Tiny electrodes placed just beneath the surface, connected to a data logger that recorded electrical activity in the soil. Margaret checked it before bed more out of habit than expectation. At 2:17 a.m., the graph spiked, not randomly, in a pattern. A slow rise, a sharp peak, then a series of smaller pulses like a heartbeat but with rhythm. She woke Elena, who rushed over in her car, still in pajamas. They watched the screen together in the dark, wrapped in blankets on the porch. For 3 hours, the pulses continued, steady, complex, almost musical. It's not random noise, Elena said, voice trembling slightly. It's structured. Like a signal. Who's it for? Margaret asked. Maybe no one. Maybe it's just how the system talks to itself. Like our nerves do. But Margaret had taught long enough to know that patterns mean purpose. And this one felt alive. The next day, news broke. Not from them, but from a local reporter who'd been tipped off by a neighbor. By noon, a short article appeared online. Mystery structure found beneath Ohio backyard. Scientists baffled. It included a blurry photo of the mound and a quote from Elena. This could change how we understand cooperation in nature. Within hours, the story went national. Not because it was flashy, but because it was quiet, real, and deeply strange. Scientists from other universities called. Documentarians asked for access. A major science journal requested preliminary data. Through it all, Margaret stayed calm. She watered her roses. She fed the birds. And every evening, she sat on her porch and watched the mound, now ringed with sensors and tiny flags like a shrine. Then on the 5th day, the bioelectrical expert arrived, a woman who'd spent her career studying forest fungi and plant communication. She brought a portable EEG-like device designed for soil. Within an hour of setting it up, she made a discovery that left everyone speechless. The electrical pulses weren't just coming from the nest. They were syncing with the oak tree's root system. The tree and the nest, they're talking, she said, eyes wide. The signals match. Same frequency, same rhythm. Margaret looked up at the old oak, its leaves rustling in the wind. She'd always felt it was watching over her. Now it seemed it was part of something far bigger. They realized then that the nest wasn't just an ant colony. It was a triad, ants, fungus, and tree, bound together in a living network that shared nutrients, information, and possibly even defense signals. The warmth, generated by microbial activity, regulated by the ants. The light, a byproduct of chemical reactions, possibly used to guide movement in the dark. The electricity, a way to send warnings or coordinate growth. It was a single breathing system, spread across species, rooted in the earth, hidden in plain sight. That night, the team held a quiet meeting under the stars. No press, no cameras. Just them and Margaret sitting on lawn chairs with mugs of tea. We can't keep this quiet much longer, Elena said. The world needs to see this. Not as a spectacle, but as a lesson? Margaret nodded. Then show it right. Show the wonder, not the fear, they agreed. No digging deeper. No removing more samples. From now on, they'd observe, record, and protect. As the others packed up their notes, Margaret stayed behind, alone with the oak. She placed her palm on its rough bark and whispered, "You've known all along, haven't you?" The wind stirred the leaves in reply. Deep below, the pulses continued, soft, steady, alive. And in that moment, Margaret understood. She hadn't found a mystery. She'd been invited into a conversation that had been going on for centuries, and she, a retired teacher with dirt under her nails, was now part of it. The world would soon learn about the Cedar Hollow symbiotic complex, as they'd started calling it. But for now, in the quiet of her backyard, it was just her, the tree, the ants, and the silent, glowing heart of the earth, beating in time with something far older, and far wiser than any of them. The calm didn't last. By the end of the week, Margaret's quiet street had become a slow-motion parade of curiosity. News vans parked at the edge of her property, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like strange metal flowers. Reporters stood just beyond the no trespassing sign she'd put up, not out of meanness but necessity, and asked the same questions over and over. Is it dangerous? Is it alien? Will it spread? She never answered them directly. Instead, she'd smile and say, "It's just part of the earth doing what it's always done, only we're finally paying attention." But attention, she was learning, came with weight. The university issued a formal statement. The site was now under scientific observation and protected by a temporary conservation order. No digging, no sampling, no drones without permission. At first, people respected it. Then came the offers. A biotech company reached out through a lawyer, offering a generous research partnership that sounded more like a purchase. A documentary crew from a major streaming service proposed turning her backyard into a live-streamed exhibit. Even a wellness brand asked if they could bottle the energy from the mound for a new line of earth-charged supplements. Margaret declined them all without hesitation. She didn't own the mound, she told Elena. She was just its caretaker. Still, the pressure grew. Scientists from 3 different countries requested access. Some wanted to study the bioelectric signals. Others were fascinated by the thermal regulation. A few whispered about potential applications, self-cooling buildings, organic circuitry, even new forms of sustainable computing. The possibilities were thrilling, but also terrifying. Because every time someone said application, Margaret heard exploitation. She started having dreams where the mound crumbled into dust and the ants scattered like ash in the wind. She'd wake up sweating, then walk barefoot to the backyard just to make sure it was still there, still breathing, still glowing faintly under the moon. One afternoon, while the team was calibrating new sensors, a man in a crisp suit showed up unannounced. He introduced himself as a representative from a federal research agency. He spoke politely, but his eyes kept scanning the yard like he was measuring it for a blueprint. "We believe this discovery has national significance," he said. "We'd like to relocate the core structure to a secure facility for long-term study." Margaret's stomach dropped. "Relocate it? You can't move it. It's part of this tree, part of this soil. It's not a machine you can unplug." The man smiled thinly. "With the right resources, we can replicate the conditions. And think of what we could learn. New medicines, clean energy, maybe even ways to reverse soil degradation." Elena stepped in gently. "Sir, we don't even understand how it stays alive yet. Uprooting it could destroy the entire system. It's not just biology, it's a relationship. And relationships don't survive transplantation." The man nodded, but his expression said he wasn't convinced. He left a business card on the porch railing. Margaret threw it away before he reached the end of the driveway. That night, she called a town meeting. Not official, just a gathering of neighbors in her backyard. Chairs pulled into a loose circle under the oak. She served lemonade and homemade bread, and when everyone was settled, she spoke plainly. "This thing in my yard, it's not mine. It's not the university's. It's not for sale, and it's not a lab experiment. It's been here longer than any of us, and it's been doing fine without us poking at it. Now that we've noticed it, the least we can do is protect it, not for what it can give us, but because it deserves to exist." To her surprise, they agreed. One neighbor, a retired farmer, said, "Back in my day, we knew better than to mess with things that worked on their own." Another, a high school biology teacher, added, "If we lose this, We lose a chance to learn how to live with nature, not just take from it. By the end of the evening, they'd formed an informal Friends of the Oak group, just a promise to keep watch, share updates, and speak up if anyone tried to turn Margaret's yard into a science fair project. But the real test came a few days later. The team had noticed a change. The ants, once indifferent to human presence, had grown more active near the surface, especially when equipment was moved or new people arrived. They weren't aggressive, but they formed dense barriers around certain tunnels as if guarding something precious. Then one morning, the thermal readings shifted. The warmth wasn't steady anymore. It pulsed in waves, rising and falling like a slow breath. It's responding, the bioelectrical expert said, studying the data, not just to us, but to the stress. Margaret felt a pang of guilt. Had their curiosity done harm? She walked out to the mound that evening and sat cross-legged on the grass, close enough to feel the warmth but not so close as to intrude. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "We didn't mean to scare you." She stayed there until the stars came out, and slowly the pulses calmed. The next morning, Elena called an emergency meeting with the university. After hours of discussion, they made a bold decision: no more invasive tools, no more core samples. From now on, all observation would be passive. Cameras, microphones, non-contact sensors. They would learn by listening, not taking. It wasn't popular with everyone. One researcher argued that without physical samples, progress would stall. But Elena stood firm. Progress isn't just about data. It's about respect. And if we lose this thing because we were too eager, we'll have learned nothing at all. Margaret overheard the conversation from the porch. For the first time in weeks, she felt hope. But the outside world wasn't done. A popular science podcast released an episode titled, "The Living Circuit. Is Earth Smarter Than We Think?" It went viral. Suddenly, Margaret's mailbox overflowed, not just with fan letters, but with wild theories. Some claimed the mound was a portal. Others said it was proof of ancient intelligence. A few even accused the scientists of covering up the truth. Then came the protesters, not angry ones, quiet ones. People who believed the mound was sacred, a gift from the earth, and that even scientific study was a form of violation. They gathered at the edge of the property with signs that read, "Let it be, and nature is not a lab." Margaret understood them. In another life, she might have stood with them. She invited their leader, a soft-spoken woman who worked at a local herbal apothecary, to sit with her on the porch. "I don't want to stop the science," the woman said. "I just don't want it to become a show. Or a product." "Neither do I," Margaret replied. "That's why I said no to the cameras, no to the companies, no to anyone who sees this as a resource instead of a relative." They talked for hours. By the end, the woman promised to help spread the message. Observe, don't interfere. Protect, don't possess. Meanwhile, the scientific community began to shift too. Papers started appearing, not just about the structure itself, but about the ethics of studying living systems that show signs of awareness. Conferences added panels on non-extractive research. Students wrote theses on symbiotic intelligence. Slowly, the conversation changed from "what can we take?" to "what can we learn by being still?" Back in the yard, life settled into a new rhythm. The team came less often but stayed longer when they did. They brought fewer machines and more notebooks. They sat quietly, watched, listened. Sometimes they just sat with Margaret, sharing stories about other wonders they'd seen. The way bees dance, how trees share food through roots, the silent language of lichen on stone. And the mound responded. The pulses grew steadier. The ants resumed their old paths. New nodules formed along the outer walls, glowing brighter than before. One morning, Margaret found a single white flower blooming at the base of the oak, a species she'd never planted, with petals that shimmered faintly in the dawn light. "It's a gift," Elena said, eyes glistening. Thank you." Margaret didn't know if that was science or poetry, but it felt true. As summer deepened, the frenzy outside began to fade. The news vans left. The offers stopped coming. The world moved on to the next big thing. But in Cedar Hollow, something had changed, not just in the soil, but in the people too. Children from the local school started a nature watch club, learning to observe insects and plants without disturbing them. The town council passed a resolution to protect native ecosystems, inspired by the Oak Project. Even the local hardware store began selling native wildflower seeds instead of chemical pesticides. Margaret, for her part, went back to gardening. But now she worked differently. She left patches of bare soil for insects. She planted flowers that fed pollinators. She stopped pulling every weed, realizing some were homes, not nuisances. One evening, as she watered her roses, she noticed something new. Tiny trails of ants, different from the mound's residents, were moving along the garden path, carrying bits of leaf. They weren't heading toward the oak. They were building something of their own near the hydrangeas. She smiled. Life was spreading, not because they'd told it to, but because they'd made space for it. The real shock, she realized, wasn't what they'd found beneath the ground. It was what it had awakened in them. Humility, wonder, and the quiet understanding that the earth doesn't need us to fix it. It just needs us to stop breaking it. And in that truth, she found peace. The mound still hummed. The tree still stood. And Margaret Ellis, retired teacher and accidental guardian, knew her work wasn't done. It had just begun. Time has a way of softening edges, of turning shock into understanding, noise into quiet, and strangers into neighbors. A year after that first warm mound appeared beneath the old oak, Margaret's backyard no longer felt like a scientific anomaly. It felt like home again, only deeper, richer, as if the earth itself had leaned in to whisper a secret she was finally learning to hear. The frenzy had faded. The news vans were long gone. The offers from companies had dried up once it became clear that no one would be allowed to harvest or replicate what lived beneath the soil. Instead, something quieter and more lasting took root: respect. The university, after months of careful study and public consultation, worked with the state to designate a small portion of Margaret's property, just enough to include the oak and the mound, as a permanent conservation and research reserve. Not a lab, not a tourist attraction, just a protected space where scientists could observe, students could learn, and nature could simply be. Margaret didn't sell the land. She donated a conservation easement, ensuring that no matter who owned the house in the future, that patch of earth would remain untouched. She didn't do it for fame. She'd turned down interviews, book deals, even an invitation to speak at a major science conference. "I'm not the story," she'd told Elena gently. "The story is what's happening under our feet. I just happened to be paying attention." But the world hadn't forgotten her. On a crisp autumn morning, a small ceremony was held in her backyard. No cameras, no speeches, just a handful of people who'd walked with her through the whole journey. The university presented her with a simple plaque, mounted on a smooth river stone near the garden path. It read, "In gratitude to the one who noticed." She touched the words with her fingertips and smiled. That was enough. The scientific papers came slowly, carefully. Not flashy headlines, but thoughtful studies published in respected journals. One detailed the tripartite relationship between the ants, the glowing fungus-like organism, and the oak's root system, what they now called the Cedar Hollow Symbiotic Complex. Another explored the low-voltage bioelectric network that pulsed through the soil, suggesting it might help the system share resources and respond to environmental changes in real time. A third proposed that the warmth wasn't just metabolic, it was a form of climate buffering, keeping the inner chambers stable even during cold snaps or droughts. None of the papers claimed to have all the answers. In fact, they all ended with the same humble note: "This is only the beginning." What surprised Margaret most wasn't the science, it was how it changed people. Teachers began using the story in classrooms not as a mystery to solve, but as a lesson in patience and observation. What if we looked at the world like Margaret did? They'd ask their students, not to take, but to see. Local schools organized field trips, not to her yard, but to nearby woods and meadows, where kids learned to watch ants, trace root patterns, and listen to the wind in the trees. They called it slow science, and it stuck. Even the ants seemed to sense the shift. Their movements grew calmer, more open. They no longer sealed off tunnels when researchers approached. Instead, they went about their work as if they knew they were safe. And the mound? It kept growing, not outward, but inward, deepening its roots into the earth like a quiet promise. One spring morning, nearly 2 years after it all began, Margaret sat on her porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft golds and pinks. The oak stood tall, its leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. At its base, the mound glowed faintly, a soft, steady pulse of light visible only in the dim dawn. She'd grown used to the rhythm now. The pulses came every few minutes like a slow heartbeat. Sometimes they quickened after rain. Sometimes they slowed in deep cold, but they never stopped. Elena stopped by that afternoon, not in her field gear but in jeans and a sweater, carrying a basket of fresh strawberries from her own garden. She'd become a regular visitor, not as a scientist but as a friend. "They're naming a new course after the project," she said, sitting beside Margaret on the porch swing. "Symbiotic systems and ethical observation. It'll be required for all ecology students," Margaret chuckled. "I hope they teach them to bring cookies when they visit someone's backyard." "They do," Elena said, smiling, "and to ask permission before they dig." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching a robin hop across the grass. Then Elena said softly, "You changed how we do science, you know. Not by discovering something new, but by reminding us how to be human while we look." Margaret shook her head. "I just didn't want to break what was already working." "Exactly," Elena said. "And that's the hardest lesson of all." As the years passed, the mound became part of the town's quiet legend. New families moving to Cedar Hollow would hear about the Thinking Hill and come to see it for themselves. Not to gawk, but to sit quietly, as Margaret had taught them. Some left small stones or wildflowers as thanks. Others just sat and listened. Margaret never charged a penny. She never put up signs explaining what it was. She believed the best way to honor a mystery was to let it remain mysterious. Her garden flourished. Without chemical sprays, without constant tilling, the soil grew richer. Bees returned in numbers she hadn't seen since childhood. Even the roses bloomed brighter, their petals deeper red, as if fed by something deeper than water and sun. She often thought about the white flower that had appeared that first summer, the one she hadn't planted. It came back every year, always in the same spot, always glowing faintly at dusk. She never learned its name, and she didn't need to. One evening, when she was 72, Margaret hosted a small gathering for the local nature club. Children and grandparents sat together on blankets, sharing stories about birds, mushrooms, and the way fog moves through the valley. A little girl, no older than 8, tugged at Margaret's sleeve. "Do you think the earth is alive?" she asked, eyes wide. Margaret looked toward the oak, where fireflies had just begun to blink in the twilight. "I don't think," she said gently. "I know." The girl nodded as if that was the most natural answer in the world. Later that night, alone on the porch, Margaret felt a deep peace settle over her. She wasn't famous. She hadn't invented anything. She hadn't even done anything extraordinary, just paid attention when most people would have walked past. But in that simple act of noticing, she'd helped the world remember something it had forgotten. That wonder doesn't live in distant galaxies or deep oceans alone. It lives in backyards, under oaks, in the quiet hum of a nest that's more than a nest. She stood slowly, her knees a little stiff now, and walked to the edge of the mound. She didn't touch it. She just stood there, breathing in the scent of damp earth and old wood. "Thank you," she whispered. And for a moment, the pulses quickened as if in reply. Years later, long after Margaret was gone, the oak still stood. The mound still glowed. And every spring, students from the university would come, not with drills or cameras, but with notebooks and silence. They'd sit where she once sat, watch the ants move in their ancient patterns, and learn the most important lesson of all, that the greatest discoveries aren't made with tools, but with tenderness. The story never became a blockbuster movie or a viral trend. It didn't need to. It lived in the way people walked through forests now, more slowly, more kindly. It lived in the gardens that left room for wild things. It lived in the quiet choice to protect rather than possess, and on still nights, if you stood very close to the old oak in Cedar Hollow, you could feel it, the soft warmth rising from the earth, the faint pulse of light beneath your feet, and the unshakable sense that you were standing not on dirt but on a living, breathing world that had been waiting all along for someone to notice. Margaret Ellis had been that someone, and because of her, so many others learned to be too.